Hiroo Onoda was a Japanese citizen who originally worked at a Chinese trading company in the bustling commercial district of Wuhan, China. His life was relatively ordinary, filled with the daily routines of business and commerce, until everything changed. When he was 20 years old, in 1942, he received the call that would alter the course of his entire life. He was conscripted to join the Japanese Imperial Army during the height of World War II. Without hesitation, demonstrating the loyalty and duty that would come to define his entire story, he promptly quit his job and headed off to military training in Japan, leaving behind his civilian life forever. At a certain point during his rigorous military training, Onoda's intelligence, dedication, and physical capabilities caught the attention of his superior officers. He was selected for an exceptional honor: to be trained at the prestigious and secretive Nakano School as an Imperial Army intelligence officer. This was no ordinary military academy. The Nakano School was Japan's premier institution for training elite intelligence operatives and guerrilla warfare specialists. In this highly specialized and intense military intelligence training program, Onoda was specifically and meticulously taught advanced methods of gathering intelligence, conducting reconnaissance missions, surviving in hostile environments with minimal resources, and how to conduct effective guerrilla warfare operations behind enemy lines. He learned to live off the land, to move silently through jungle terrain, to set ambushes, and to evade capture indefinitely. He was being carefully groomed and prepared for an extremely dangerous mission: to go in behind enemy lines and be left with small pockets of soldiers to make life miserable for Japan's enemies, disrupt their operations at every opportunity, and gather valuable intelligence in the process. The training was brutal, demanding, and designed to break weak soldiers while forging the strong into weapons of war. On December 26, 1944, as the Pacific War raged with increasing intensity and Japan's strategic position grew more desperate, Onoda was sent to Lubang Island in the Philippines, a small but strategically significant island located about 75 miles southwest of Manila. His orders from his commanding officer, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, were delivered with grave solemnity and absolute clarity. You are absolutely forbidden to die by your own hand. It may take 3 years, it may take 5, but whatever happens, we'll come back for you. Until then, so long as you have one soldier, you are to continue to lead him. You may have to live on coconuts. If that's the case, live on coconuts. Under no circumstances are you to give up your life voluntarily. These words would echo in Onoda's mind for the next 3 decades, becoming the unwavering foundation of his mission and his very existence in the jungle. Upon arrival, Onoda quickly linked up with Japanese soldiers already stationed on the island, attempting to organize them for the defensive operations he had been ordered to prepare. However, shortly thereafter, the strategic situation deteriorated rapidly. The island was overrun by overwhelming enemy forces when other officers who were already on the island, either through incompetence, fear, or differing strategic assessments, refused to help Onoda fulfill critical parts of his orders to destroy the harbor facilities and airfield, among other vital infrastructure. This failure to execute scorched earth tactics in turn made it significantly easier for the Allied forces to utilize the island's resources and establish a strong foothold. The Allied invasion force landed on February 28, 1945, bringing with them superior numbers, firepower, and air support that the scattered Japanese defenders simply could not match. Shortly after the island was conquered and the main defensive positions overrun, the remaining Japanese soldiers, following their training and survival instincts, split up into small groups of 3 or 4 men and scattered into the dense, treacherous jungle that covered much of the island's interior. This was standard guerrilla warfare doctrine: disperse, survive, and continue to resist. Most of these small groups, ill-equipped and poorly supplied for extended jungle survival, were quickly hunted down and killed off by Filipino and American patrols who knew the terrain well. However, Onoda's group, consisting of himself as the ranking officer, along with Yuichi Akatsu, Shoichi Shimada, and Kenshichi Kozuka, proved to be exceptional survivors. They were not captured or killed. Drawing upon Onoda's superior training from Nakano School, they continued to use sophisticated guerrilla warfare tactics to harry and harass the enemy troops as best they could, while strictly and carefully rationing their meager supplies, including food, ammunition, medical supplies, and other essentials. They supplemented their small rice rations, which had been meant to last only weeks, with bananas, coconuts, papayas, and other tropical food foraged from the jungle, as well as conducting dangerous nighttime raids on local farms when they could manage it, stealing vegetables, rice, and occasionally livestock. They built concealed shelters, developed early warning systems, and maintained a state of constant vigilance. Every day was a battle for survival. In October 1945, approximately 2 months after the actual end of World War II, after another guerrilla cell had killed a cow from a local farm for desperately needed food, Onoda's group came across a crudely printed leaflet from the local islanders addressed to them with a simple message. The war ended August 15th. Come down from the mountains. This was the first indication they received that the war might be over. The few remaining cells of Japanese holdouts discussed this leaflet extensively over several days, analyzing every word, every phrase, examining the paper quality and printing method. But eventually, after careful deliberation, they decided that it was Allied propaganda, a psychological warfare tactic trying to get them to give themselves up so they could be captured or killed. They felt that there was absolutely no way that Japan, with its powerful military and indomitable spirit, could have lost so quickly, in less than a year since the time when they were deployed to the island. Indeed, this would seem strange and unbelievable to anyone who had no knowledge of the devastating atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, weapons so terrible they had changed warfare forever. Additionally, another one of the cells had been fired upon by local forces just a few days before finding the leaflet. They reasoned that this hostile action wouldn't have happened if the war truly was over and hostilities had ceased. Eventually, near the end of the same year, local islanders, increasingly fed up with being shot at, having their crops stolen, and living in fear of these Japanese guerrillas, managed to get a Boeing B-17 bomber aircraft to drop thousands of leaflets all over the jungle canopy. These new leaflets had the official order to surrender printed on them, purportedly from General Tomoyuki Yamashita, one of Japan's most famous and respected commanders, known as the Tiger of Malaya. The few remaining cells once again painstakingly scrutinized these leaflets, holding emergency meetings to try to determine their authenticity, examining the signature, the wording, the paper stock, anything that might reveal whether this was genuine or an enemy trick. In the end, the specific wording on the leaflet pertaining to the method by which they would be sent back to Japan seemed suspicious and fishy to them, largely because the wording made it seem as if Japan had actually lost the war, something they simply couldn't fathom, and which was a massive psychological problem in their willingness to accept that the war had truly ended. In their minds, the logic was simple and unassailable. If Japan had won the war, their commanders would come and personally retrieve them as promised. Japan couldn't possibly lose. The emperor was divine. The military was invincible. The spirit of Yamato was eternal. Therefore, the war must still be ongoing. So they once again convinced themselves that this was merely the Allies becoming more desperate and tired of their successful guerrilla tactics and trying ever more elaborate schemes to get them to surrender and betray their sacred duty. When this leaflet campaign didn't work to bring in the holdouts, the authorities tried even more elaborate methods. More leaflets were dropped with actual newspapers from Japan showing post-war reconstruction, photographs and personal letters from the soldiers' families pleading with them to come home. Official delegates were sent from Japan and went through the jungle, speaking over loudspeakers in Japanese, begging the soldiers to give themselves up, explaining that the war was over and they would not be harmed. In every single case that the cells encountered, there was always something that seemed suspicious or off in their minds about the way it was done. some small detail that caused them to believe it was an elaborate, well-funded hoax by the Allied intelligence services, perhaps using captured Japanese personnel under duress. Years passed slowly in the humid, dangerous jungle with these 4 dedicated soldiers, continuing to perform what they believed was their sworn duty of harrying the enemy at every available opportunity, and gathering intelligence as best they could, keeping detailed mental notes about patrol patterns, troop movements, and civilian activities. At a certain point, when most everybody they observed was dressed in civilian clothing rather than military uniforms, they began thinking that this too was an elaborate ruse from the Allied forces designed to lull the Japanese guerrilla soldiers into a false sense of confidence and security. They considered the highly suspicious fact that every time they fired on these supposed civilians, shortly thereafter, well-armed and organized search parties would arrive hunting them with dogs and weapons. Behavior that seemed far too military for actual civilians. Over the years of isolation, they had gradually let their solitude and paranoia twist their minds into thinking that everyone, absolutely everyone, was an enemy combatant. Even their own fellow Japanese countrymen who would occasionally come and try to find them and convince them to come home. These people, of course, in their warped minds, were clearly Japanese prisoners of war being forced to come to lure them away from the safety of the jungle and into a trap. Eventually, after about 5 years of incredibly harsh living in the unforgiving jungle conditions, Yuichi Akatsu, the youngest member of the group, decided he simply could not continue any longer. He would surrender, but he didn't tell the other 3 soldiers of his plan, knowing they would try to stop him or potentially even view him as a traitor. So one night in 1949, he slipped quietly away from the others under cover of darkness. And after 6 months alone in the jungle, surviving by himself and avoiding his former comrades, he was finally able to successfully surrender to Filipino authorities, what he assumed were Allied troops. Because of this shocking event and the security breach it represented, Onoda's remaining cell became even more cautious, paranoid, and careful. They went into deeper hiding in more remote areas of the jungle and took far fewer risks in their operations, as they viewed Akatsu's leaving as a potentially catastrophic security threat. What if he was captured and tortured for information, they thought? What if he reveals our hiding places, our tactics, our schedules? About 5 years later, in 1954, another of the small group, Shoichi Shimada, was tragically killed in a sudden and violent skirmish with Filipino forces on the beach at Gontin. Now there were only 2 survivors remaining, Onoda, the leader, and Kozuka, his loyal subordinate. For about 17 more long, difficult years, the 2 men lived in the jungle like shadows, gathering intelligence as best they could and attacking what they believed were enemy troops when they could risk it, always melting back into the jungle before counterattacks could be organized. They were still utterly convinced that eventually Japan would dispatch more troops to reinforce them, and they would then train these fresh troops in the sophisticated guerrilla warfare techniques they had perfected, and use the extensive intelligence they had painstakingly gathered over the years to retake the island in a glorious counteroffensive. After all, their orders from Major Taniguchi had been crystal clear. Stay put and continue operations exactly as they had been doing until their commanding officer came personally and retrieved them. And their commanding officer had solemnly promised to do so no matter what, no matter how long it took. Then, in October 1972, after an almost unbelievable 27 years of hiding and surviving in the jungle, Kinshichi Kozuka was killed during an intense firefight with a Filipino patrol on the island. The Japanese government had long assumed he had already died years earlier. They didn't think it was humanly possible that he could have survived so long in such brutal conditions in the jungle. But now when they recovered his body and confirmed his identity, they began thinking perhaps Hiroo Onoda might also still be alive somewhere in that jungle, even though he too had also long since been officially declared dead, and his name had been added to the lists of war casualties. The Japanese government, feeling a mixture of responsibility and disbelief, then sent an official search party to try to find Onoda in the jungle and bring him home. Unfortunately for them, he was far too skilled at hiding after 27 years of constant practice, of perfecting camouflage techniques, of learning every trail and hiding spot on the island. Despite their best efforts, they could not find any trace of him. Onoda continued his solitary mission, now completely alone for the first time. Finally, in 1974, a young and adventurous college dropout named Norio Suzuki, who was searching for meaning and excitement in his life, decided to travel the world on a shoestring budget. Among his quirky list of things he wanted to accomplish on his journey was to find 3 things he considered mysteries: Lieutenant Onoda, a panda, and the abominable snowman. With youthful enthusiasm and determination, he traveled to Lubang Island and trekked through the dangerous jungle, searching for any signs of Onoda, asking locals about sightings, studying the areas where recent incidents had occurred. Shockingly, where literally thousands of others over the last 29 years had failed, including trained military search teams, local guides, and government officials, Suzuki, through a combination of persistence, luck, and genuine respect for Onoda's mission, succeeded. He actually found Onoda's carefully concealed dwelling place and met the man himself face to face. Suzuki then proceeded to try to convince Onoda to come home with him to Japan, explaining that the war had been over for nearly 3 decades, that Japan had rebuilt and was now a prosperous, peaceful nation. But Onoda refused absolutely and without hesitation. His commanding officer, Major Taniguchi, had said they would return for him no matter what happened. He would not surrender, nor believe the war was truly over until Major Taniguchi himself returned and personally ordered him to stand down. At this point in time, Onoda explained he would not be allowed to simply go home as a returning soldier. Under the current circumstances, he would be required to surrender as a war criminal and throw himself on the mercy of the Filipino government. Over the decades, he had been far too successful at using the deadly guerrilla tactics he had mastered at Nakano School, killing approximately 30 Filipinos and injuring over 100 others, as well as destroying various crops, burning fields, and stealing livestock for almost 30 years. He had blood on his hands, and he knew it. Suzuki, realizing he couldn't convince Onoda alone, then traveled back to Japan with the incredible news that he'd actually found the legendary holdout. Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, now retired from military service and quietly working at a small bookstore in Tokyo, was then urgently contacted and brought back to Lubang Island to meet with his former subordinate. On March 9, 1974, Taniguchi trekked into the jungle to the location where Onoda was waiting and formally told him that Japan had lost the war nearly 3 decades earlier, and he was to give up his weapons and formally surrender to the Filipino government. For Onoda, these were the only words that could end his mission. As you might expect, after living in the brutal jungle for 29 years, doing what he thought was his sacred duty, helping Japan win the war. But it now only turned out to be wasting nearly 3 decades of his life. And worse, killing and injuring innocent civilians who were just trying to live their lives. This realization came as a crushing, devastating blow to Onoda's psyche. In his own words from his autobiography, "We really lost the war. How could they have been so sloppy? Suddenly everything went black. A storm raged inside me. I felt like a fool for having been so tense and cautious on the way here. Worse than that, what had I been doing for all these years?" Gradually, the storm subsided, and for the first time, I really understood. My 30 years as a guerrilla fighter for the Japanese army were abruptly finished. This was the end. I pulled back the bolt on my rifle and unloaded the bullets. I eased off the pack that I always carried with me and laid the gun on top of it. Would I really have no more use for this rifle that I had polished and cared for like a baby all these years? Or Kozuka's rifle, which I had hidden in a crevice in the rocks? Had the war really ended 30 years ago? If it had, what had Shimada and Kozuka died for? If what was happening was true, wouldn't it have been better if I had died with them? On March 9th, 1974, at 52 years old, and then formally on March 10th, 1975, in a ceremony arranged for the occasion, Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda, in his full Imperial Army uniform that was somehow still immaculately kept despite decades in the jungle, marched with military precision out of the jungle in front of cameras and dignitaries, and formally surrendered his samurai sword, his rifle, ammunition, hand grenades, and his military dagger to Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos. President Marcos, in a decision that was very unpopular among many Filipinos who had suffered from Onoda's actions, but was immensely popular in Japan, where Onoda was viewed as a symbol of loyalty and duty, granted Onoda a full pardon for his crimes. Marcos reasoned that Onoda had genuinely thought he was still at war the entire time, and was simply following his military orders as he understood them. Onoda submitting his samurai sword to the president in a formal military ceremony. Now, in the end, we might look at Hiroo Onoda as a tragic fool and worse, a murderer of innocent people who were simply trying to rebuild their lives after the war. In the end, he was both of those things. There is no denying this uncomfortable truth. But at the same time, not everyone who lives by strict convictions, who maintains unwavering discipline, and who puts their all into achieving what they believe to be the right thing, ends up having what they strive towards turn out well, or end up being a good thing in retrospect. This is one of those complex, morally ambiguous cases where someone did something objectively remarkable from a survival and dedication standpoint, showing extreme dedication to his country and his duty, as well as fortitude and resilience unmatched by many in history. Had circumstances been different and the war really had waged on for so long, had Japan somehow managed to continue fighting for 3 decades, then soldiers and people from both sides of the conflict would have respected him for his extraordinary courage, dedication, and survival skills. In that respect, he was more of a hero figure. However, the world wasn't the way he thought it was. And in the end, in retrospect, he was more of a fool than anything else. A man who wasted 30 years of his life for nothing. But at the same time, we can't ignore that this was a man who did something great with respect to doing something that very few others could have done. Had circumstances been as he thought, what he accomplished was something to be admired and celebrated. He faced what he believed was death around every corner and lived in an extreme, hostile situation for 30 years, fighting for his country with every breath. That level of dedication should be respected, even if the cause was ultimately misguided. It's an extremely rare person who could endure something like that and never quit or surrender. Never take the easy way out, as most of us do all the time when faced with adversity that is orders of magnitude less severe than what Onoda faced for almost 30 years in the Philippine jungle. Bonus Onoda facts. When Onoda returned to Japan in 1974, he was initially seen as a national hero, a living symbol of the old samurai spirit and unwavering loyalty. He was treated like a celebrity, gave interviews, and received fan mail from around the country. He was also given his full back pay for the last 30 years of service, which amounted to a substantial sum. However, life was dramatically different in modern Japan than he remembered from 1944, and the changes were not at all to his liking. He felt like a man out of time. Many of the traditional Japanese virtues he had cherished, such as patriotism, duty, honor, and self-sacrifice, were nearly non-existent in the new consumer-focused culture. Indeed, in his view, Japan now kowtowed to the rest of the world, particularly to the United States, and had lost its pride, independence, and sense of itself as a unique culture. Deeply disillusioned, he moved to Brazil in 1975 and used his military back pay to buy himself a large cattle ranch there, where he could live according to his values. He eventually married and tried to build a new life far from the Japan that disappointed him so deeply. Onoda released an autobiography titled No Surrender, My 30-Year War, in which he details his extraordinary life as a guerrilla fighter, his daily survival routines, his mental struggles, and his philosophical reflections on duty, loyalty, and the meaning of his mission. The book became an international bestseller and has been translated into numerous languages. After reading about a Japanese teenager who had brutally murdered his own parents in 1980, Onoda became even more distressed and concerned about the state of his country and the younger generation in Japan. He saw this as a symptom of a deeper cultural sickness, a loss of discipline, respect, and purpose. He then returned to Japan in 1984 with a mission, establishing the Onoda Shizenjuku, Onoda Nature School, for young people, where he could personally teach them various survival techniques, outdoor skills, self-reliance, and attempt to instill in them the values of discipline, perseverance, and what he considered to be the traditional Japanese spirit. He wanted to help create better, stronger, more independent Japanese citizens who could face hardship without giving up. In May 1996, at age 74, he returned to the Philippines to Lubang Island, the place where he had lived in hiding for 30 years, donating $10,000 to local schools as a gesture of reconciliation and apology. As you might imagine, despite his donation and apparent remorse, he is not particularly popular with the locals there, many of whom remember family members who were killed or injured by his actions. The wounds he inflicted were deep and personal, and money couldn't fully heal them. Hiroo Onoda in his last days. Hiroo Onoda died on January 16, 2014, at the age of 91 from heart failure at a hospital in Tokyo. To the end, he maintained his military bearing and his conviction that he had done his duty as he understood it. He absolutely deserves respect for his endurance and dedication, even if his mission was ultimately tragically misguided. His story remains one of the most extraordinary and complex tales of the 20th century.